Let's try to think back and remember the early days of the pandemic, when it was new and so was the anxiety that accompanied it. Most of us had never experienced anything like that before, even though this is hardly the first pandemic humankind has had to live through. Also, as we remember, we're doing so with kindness, not judgmentalism. We're not going to be cruel to our past selves, just observant. One of the things that I remember from those early days of the pandemic is the shortages, the things there were not enough of. While some of the things that disappeared from the store shelves could be substituted, others were essentials, and their scarcity just added stress to an already stressful situation, especially the lack of toilet paper. I don't know about you, but I can still see those empty aisles at Kroger. And I can well remember when the online subscription of toilet paper delivery that my husband and I had set up long before it began was suddenly, without notice, just discontinued. There was just no more toilet paper. Now, do you remember why there was no toilet paper? It wasn't because there weren't enough factories making it or producing it. It wasn't because there were fewer trees being produced for pulp. It wasn't because there weren't enough truck drivers to deliver the toilet paper to the stores. It wasn't because of a shortage of workers to make, package, and stock the toilet paper. In reality, the truth is, there was plenty of toilet paper in our country for everyone. So why were the shelves bare? Walter Brueggemann, who is an Episcopal theologian, has a biblical answer to this question. According to Brueggemann, people who have plenty often react to changes with anxiety and fears of scarcity. In other words, one of the greatest fears people have in the face of change is that they're going to lose something, or maybe many things. And this fear manifests in behaviors of accumulation, control over resources by creating a monopoly, and even violence. The uncertainty created by the pandemic caused fear, and some people responded to that fear by buying more toilet paper than they needed, even for just a little 2-week period. Think about the fights over that last package of toilet paper in the stores that would always make the news. And remember those who bought up toilet paper and then tried to sell it online for ridiculous prices? Suddenly, how well people were dealing with the pandemic was evidenced by how much toilet paper they had. And that's how the greed of a few transformed abundance into scarcity for all. Brueggemann calls this phenomenon totalizing narratives. One example from the Bible of this kind of narrative is the story of the Exodus and how Pharaoh kept the Hebrew people enslaved by telling them life outside Egypt was one of scarcity and desolation. They may not have much, but what little they did have was better than nothing, and what they had was due to the benevolence of Pharaoh, who had the monopoly on every resource. Remember from the story, the Hebrew slaves were not building pyramids, they were building storehouses. Throughout their journey in the wilderness, however, they learned that the narrative of Pharaoh was a lie. There was plenty to share. The wilderness was not desolate. It's a place where God was with them and where God provided for them. Similarly, in the Gospels, we see the Roman Empire had that same narrative. They had all the power, even over the Jewish religion. An example of this is that the Roman authorities kept in their possession the vestments Jewish religious leaders wore during their sacred ceremonies. So every year, the high priest had to formally ask the Roman governor to let them use their own vestments, with the underlying threat that if they had said or did anything against Rome, then they would be denied permission to hold their own ceremonies because the governor would withhold those vestments. To understand totalizing narratives, just think total control. And sadly, this narrative isn't only a thing of the past. Perhaps you can think of a modern example of an institution or a system that attempts to maintain control over people through scarcity, through the fear of not enough. And that's why the narrative of today's gospel, where Jesus fed so many people and everyone having enough, is such a dangerous and important one, because it dismantles and disproves those narratives of Rome, Pharaoh, and our modern totalizing narratives that power only comes through total control. The miracle called the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle recorded in all four Gospels. Today, we heard the author of John's version, which is filled with references from other stories from the Old Testament. Now, these references should not be glossed over or dismissed because they can help us understand what kind of miracle this is and why it was remembered by all the Gospel writers. Now, our modern 21st century bias towards consumerism too often misinterprets this miracle as just one of multiplication. In other words, without meaning to, we probably think of Jesus as supersizing a child's lunch of 5 loaves and 2 fish into enough food to feed 5,000 hungry people. But Jesus was not the equivalent or the ancient equivalent of fast food nor a feeding program. Instead, I believe through that miracle of feeding so many people, Jesus was challenging the lie of the totalizing narrative. To see this a little more clearly, we need to look at the many references to the Old Testament's promises of salvation in today's gospel. First, we'll start with why the large crowd was there with Jesus. It wasn't because they were physically hungry. It wasn't because they were looking for a show or a free meal. John's gospel says it was because they saw the signs that Jesus had been doing for the sick. They saw that Jesus was healing people and recognized that meant he was restoring them to wholeness. This is a sign of who Jesus is. He is not discarding the sick as society tended and sometimes still tends to do. This is a sign of God's presence. That's why the people showed up. Not because they were hungry, but because they were lonely. Lonely for God. Now, we heard before they were fed, the people sat down on a grassy place. This is intended to remind us of Psalm 24, where the Good Shepherd leads his followers to the green pastures, which symbolized safe places where the flocks would not fear attack while they grazed. We also heard the leftovers were important as they illustrated nothing was lost, just as Jesus didn't lose anything or anyone entrusted to his care. And both references are, of course, to Jesus as the Good Shepherd. The author of John's Gospel wrote this miracle happened right around the yearly observance of the Passover. And this means we're meant to remember that specific time of miracles was also a narrative of liberation, a breaking free from the oppression of the totalizing narrative of slavery under Pharaoh. It also reminds us of how during their 40-year journey through the wilderness, God was with God's people and provided for them by feeding them manna, the bread from heaven. Interestingly, unique to John's Gospel, maybe you noticed that it was Jesus who distributed the bread and the fish himself. This has Eucharistic overtones. Jesus is present in the bread as he is present in the Eucharist. And Jesus is feeding the people like God fed the people in the wilderness. It also points to the food itself as not being just the kind that fills bellies, but is food from heaven, which makes this meal a sacramental one. The food came from a child who was willing to give all he had to Jesus to share. This detail harkens to the prophecy of Isaiah's peaceable kingdom, where we read every year in Advent about a little child shall lead the way to that peaceable kingdom. one that is so much different from the suffering and oppression too many people are too familiar with. These observations have led biblical scholar Raymond Brown to notice the bread itself is described in detail only in John's Gospel as loaves of barley. Brown reminds us barley was the bread of the poor in Jesus' day and suggests that this means the feeding of the 5,000 was perhaps a messianic banquet for the poor, showing that God identifies not with the wealthy and the powerful, but with the poor and those who notice the signs of God among them. Now, while we modern readers of the Bible often interpret the story as a reason to offer feeding programs, which are good, and you know I'm in support of, and I'm not speaking against, but I wonder if we tend to forget that there is something deeper going on in this story. Something that might be more difficult to hear or recognize because we have trouble imagining an economy that isn't about greedily consuming all you can. For example, there is a pragmatic theory some commentators have about this miracle, that the way people were able to eat their fill that day was because they all followed Jesus' example and began sharing whatever food they happened to have had with them. Indigenous people like botanist and author Robin Wall Kimmerer refer to this as a gift economy, one based on sharing without expectation of receiving in return for giving. Maybe that is what happened that day. We weren't there, so we don't really know. But maybe how so many people were filled as mystery points to what this miracle is about: salvation. Throughout most of history, and even today, it was and is a rarity for the majority of people on this planet to eat their fill. Now, I'm not talking about overindulging like we Americans can excel at. I'm talking about eating enough to be satisfied, something perhaps we can take for granted. In a place and a time where those in power held people back through that totalizing narrative, where the wealthy few ate well and everyone else didn't eat at all, the idea of having enough to be satisfied was a sign of God's kingdom and a powerful alternative narrative to totality. Even today, it's a radical notion because the miracle of Jesus is not a miracle of excess, but abundance as a sign of salvation and God's presence. Episcopal priest Alice Downs describes abundance in her book about making bread called Leaven for Our Lives this way, when she wrote, quote, "True abundance is not suffocating wealth or too many cookies in the cookie jar. True abundance is having just enough and knowing it to be a blessing. Instead of getting and holding on to more than enough, is insisting rather that getting and holding on to more than enough is greed, and greed is the enemy of abundance. When we become convinced that we don't have enough, even the small shortfall can make us lose our vision of heavenly Jerusalem, and we become self-absorbed and our compassion grows cold. To me, that sounds a lot like what happened to the toilet paper, the hand sanitizer, and the baking ingredients like flour and yeast in those first months of the pandemic. Too many people panicked, got greedy, and didn't think about others, and compassion grew cold. Because they didn't know how to look for Christ in their midst, and made the mistake of believing that buying and hoarding would give them the security they were afraid of losing. Today's gospel gives us the reminder purchasing or consuming will not and cannot rescue us from a pandemic, climate change, or any sin. Salvation isn't and cannot be found through credit cards. Instead, salvation is found in the kind of miracle Jesus created and gave to those seated on the good green grass, from what was given in faith and trust, not hoarded out of fear. Today's gospel reminds us we already have enough. There is an abundance. There is plenty when we make room for each other and remember God is with us. And this is such an essential reminder because we need it to help us as we follow Jesus and help us recognize that this same miracle is actually still happening today, right here at Church of the Good Shepherd, right behind Ted, Michael, and Lois is our tree of giving, where an initial donation of only 150 face masks has transformed into more than 600 masks given away during the pandemic. This is not a miracle of multiplication. It is a miracle of God with us. It is one way our neighbors have recognized we are in this with them. They are not alone. And hopefully is giving them a taste of how we believe God is with all of us through this pandemic. And at the very least, it shows that we care because God cares. And now we can use that same spirit of abundance as we look to adapting and restarting our other ministries, to renew and recreate our space here outside and eventually inside, to be safe places for prayer and reflection and sharing, all the while showing our neighbors there is another kingdom that is present right here and right now, a kingdom that is still dismantling those totalizing narratives. The kingdom narrative based on abundance and God's love, calling out to us all to remember every human being is not a cog in someone else's wheel. We are all beloved children of God. And that's the kingdom of God narrative, reminding us God is here with us through every change. Amen.